On November 8, 2023, at 14:27 UTC, astronaut Carson Webb was 41 minutes into a routine EVA, extravehicular activity, outside the International Space Station when something appeared in his peripheral vision that should not have been there. Webb, 41 years old, a NASA mission specialist since 2012, with 3 previous ISS expeditions totaling 562 days in orbit, and a former Navy test pilot with over 3,000 flight hours, was conducting scheduled maintenance on the station's starboard radiator array when he noticed it. A sphere, approximately 2 meters in diameter, perfectly smooth. Metallic surface reflecting sunlight with the kind of mirror finish that doesn't exist on any known spacecraft or debris. It was holding position 40 meters away, matching the station's orbital velocity of 17,500 miles per hour with impossible precision. "Houston, this is Webb," he said, his voice carrying the controlled calm that comes from years of training and the understanding that panic uses oxygen you can't afford to waste. "I have visual on an unidentified object, bearing 090 relative to my position. Distance approximately 40 meters. Spherical, metallic, diameter roughly 2 meters. No visible markings, no propulsion signature, no thermal bloom." Riley Chen, the Capcom on duty at Mission Control in Houston, responded within the standard 2-second communication delay. "Copy that, Webb. Stand by for tracking data." There was a pause, longer than usual, before Riley's voice came back. "Webb, we're not showing anything on proximity radar at that bearing. Can you confirm visual?" Carson turned his helmet-mounted camera toward the object. Through his visor, against the black void of space and the curved blue arc of Earth 380 kilometers below, the sphere was undeniable. "Affirmative visual confirmation, Houston. Object is stationary relative to station velocity. I'm seeing clear reflection of solar arrays on its surface." He checked his suit telemetry display. "All systems nominal. Oxygen at 87%. No radiation spikes. No electromagnetic interference. The object simply existed where it shouldn't, doing what it couldn't." Riley's voice returned, now with a different undertone, the subtle shift that happens when training meets something outside the manual. "Webb, we need you to maintain your current position. Do not approach the object. We're conferring with Flight Director." That's when Carson noticed something that made his pulse spike, despite 16 months of cumulative time in microgravity, teaching him that elevated heart rate burns precious reserves. He adjusted his position using a brief firing of his EMU, extravehicular mobility unit, thrusters to rotate 15 degrees clockwise. The sphere moved, not randomly, not drifting. It rotated exactly 15 degrees clockwise, maintaining the precise 40-meter distance. Same angle, same arc. Like a mirror image in 3-dimensional space. Carson waited 3 seconds, then fired thrusters again, this time pitching forward 20 degrees. The sphere matched it. 20 degrees. 0.3 seconds delay. The delay was too short for remote control from Earth. That would require at minimum 4 seconds for signal round trip. Too precise for autonomous tracking by any system he knew existed. "Houston, the object is mirroring my movements," Carson reported, keeping his breathing steady, maintaining protocol even as his brain processed an impossibility. "I have executed 2 independent thrust maneuvers. Object replicated both with sub-second delay and exact angular matching." There was silence from Houston. 4 seconds, 6 seconds, 10 seconds. Finally, Riley's voice, now joined by another, Dr. Quinn Morrison, Director of Flight Operations, his Texas accent clipped with authority. "Webb, this is Flight. We need you to continue your observations but make no additional approach vectors. Commander Marcus is monitoring from cupola. Can you confirm if object displays any luminescence or active energy signature?" Carson checked his suit's radiation detector again. "Nothing." He looked at the sphere through his visor's polarized setting. No heat signature. No radio emission detectable by his suit comm system. No visible reaction drive. No ion glow. No chemical propellant. No atmospheric interaction because there was no atmosphere. The object was maintaining 17,500 miles per hour in low Earth orbit, with no apparent means of propulsion, tracking his movements with precision that implied active observation, and doing it all while being completely invisible to the station's radar array. Inside the ISS, Commander Marcus Hayes was pressed against the observation window in the cupola module, Earth rotating beneath him in its eternal ballet of blues and whites and browns. He could see Carson's white suit against the black, see the robotic arm extending from the station's truss, see the solar arrays stretched like golden wings, and he could see the sphere, clear as the sunrise that came every 90 minutes at this altitude. "Houston, this is Marcus. Visual confirmation from cupola. I have eyes on the object. It's there." The confirmation from Commander Marcus Hayes inside the station changed everything, because it meant this wasn't a hallucination brought on by isolation or a malfunction in Carson's helmet display or some trick of light and exhaustion. Two trained observers, one outside in the void and one inside behind reinforced glass, both seeing the same impossible thing. Dr. Quinn Morrison's voice came through with the kind of measured authority that Carson had heard before, the tone that mission directors use when they're buying time to think, when the playbook doesn't have a page for what's happening. "Webb, Marcus, maintain observation protocols. We're running diagnostic checks on tracking systems and conferring with Space Surveillance Network. Webb, continue your EVA checklist, but keep that object in visual range. Report any changes in behavior, distance, or appearance." Carson returned to the radiator maintenance, his gloved hands moving through the familiar sequence of loosening thermal couplings and checking coolant lines, but his attention was split, divided between the technical task that had brought him out here and the sphere that hung in space like a period at the end of a sentence no one knew how to finish. He worked for 6 minutes, methodical and precise, tethered to the station's truss by a safety line that could hold 2,200 pounds of force, his EMU suit maintaining pressure at 4.3 pounds per square inch, oxygen flow nominal, carbon dioxide scrubbers functioning within parameters, and the sphere stayed exactly 40 meters away, adjusting its position with microscopic precision every time the station's orbital mechanics shifted even fractionally. It was matching not just velocity, but trajectory, compensating for the station's slight wobble, its gradual drift, the tiny perturbations caused by atmospheric drag at this altitude, and the gravitational influences of the moon and sun. After those 6 minutes, Carson made a decision that wasn't in any manual but felt necessary for reasons he couldn't articulate, the kind of instinct that separates test pilots from transport pilots, the willingness to probe an unknown variable instead of just documenting it. He fired his suit's safer thruster system, the simplified aid for EVA rescue jets that every spacewalker carries as a last resort mobility option, executing a sharp yaw rotation of 45 degrees to his right. The sphere moved, 45 degrees, same direction, 0.3 of a second delay. He pitched forward 30 degrees. The sphere matched it. He rolled. It rolled. He executed a complex combination, pitch and yaw and roll in rapid sequence, The kind of three-axis maneuver that required conscious thought and precise thruster timing. The sphere replicated it perfectly, like a reflection that existed in vacuum instead of glass, like something that understood not just where he was, but where he intended to be. "Houston, I'm observing perfect mimicry across all three axes," Carson reported, his voice still controlled, but now carrying an edge of something else. Not fear exactly, but recognition. The understanding that he was interacting with something that possessed capability beyond anything in the current human aerospace inventory. Delay between my maneuvers and object response is consistent at approximately 0.3 seconds. No variation, no drift. It's tracking with precision that would require active sensor suite and autonomous maneuvering system. But I'm detecting zero electromagnetic emissions, zero thermal signature, zero visual evidence of any propulsion mechanism. Riley's response came back, and Carson could hear keyboard clicks in the background. Could imagine the mission control room in Houston, where dozens of specialists were now probably gathered around monitors, looking at telemetry that didn't make sense, and camera feeds that showed something that shouldn't exist. "Copy that, Webb. We're seeing the tracking data now. Blake's reviewing the numbers. Stand by." Blake Torres, the telemetry specialist who could read orbital mechanics like poetry and who had worked the console for 43 shuttle missions before the program ended, would be looking at velocity vectors and position data, at the mathematical impossibility of an object maintaining this kind of precision without thrust. Carson continued the maintenance work because stopping would burn oxygen on nothing productive, because keeping hands busy helped the mind stay sharp, because protocol said complete the mission objectives unless flight declares an abort. 18 minutes had passed since first visual contact. 20 minutes. 23 minutes. The sphere maintained its vigil, 40 meters away. A silent witness to human activity in the realm where humans didn't belong, where every breath required machinery, and every movement fought against the fundamental truth that this environment would kill you in 90 seconds if your suit failed. Commander Marcus, watching from Cupola, activated the station's external camera array. 6 high-definition cameras positioned around the ISS truss and modules to provide complete visual coverage for robotic operations and approach documentation. He selected Camera 3, which had direct line of sight to Carson's work area, and zoomed in on the sphere. The image on his monitor showed it clearly, sunlight gleaming off that impossible mirror surface, Earth's terminator line visible in the curved reflection. He switched to Camera 5. Same view? Different angle? Then Camera 2. All 6 cameras were tracking. All 6 were recording to the station's solid-state storage system, redundant backup that NASA had installed after learning hard lessons about data preservation from earlier programs. "Houston, this is Marcus. All external cameras have visual lock on object. Recording is active across all channels." That's when Dr. Quinn Morrison's voice came back, with an instruction that Carson had only heard twice before in his entire career, both times during thruster failures that could have sent astronauts tumbling into the void. "Webb, this is Flight. We need you to terminate EVA and initiate immediate return to airlock. Priority 1. Acknowledge." Carson didn't hesitate, didn't ask why, because Priority 1 meant move now and question later. "Copy. Flight. Terminating EVA. Initiating return." He secured the thermal coupling he'd been adjusting, stowed his tools in the worksite interface, and began the careful hand-over-hand translation back along the truss toward Quest Airlock, his tether sliding along its track, his movements deliberate despite the urgency in Quinn's voice. The sphere followed, maintaining 40 meters, matching every movement. And then, as Carson reached the airlock's thermal cover, and Marcus watched from inside, and Riley monitored from Houston, and Blake stared at telemetry screens that showed impossible data. All 6 external cameras that operated on independent power systems and separate data buses and redundant control circuits, cameras that had a combined failure probability of less than 1 in 847 million during any given operational period, went dark simultaneously. Not a gradual degradation, not a sequential failure. Instant, complete, synchronized loss of signal across all 6 feeds. The timestamps showed it happened within the same 1/10 of a second. Statistically, impossible. Technically, unexplainable. And perfectly timed to the moment Carson entered the airlock and lost direct visual contact with the sphere. Inside the Quest airlock, Carson cycled through depressurization, watching the gauge drop from 14.7 pounds per square inch down to the station's internal pressure of 14.2, the mechanical process giving him time to think about what he'd just witnessed, what had just witnessed him. The sphere had stayed out there for 23 minutes, mirroring his every movement with precision that implied intention, implied awareness, and then the cameras had failed at the exact moment he could no longer observe it directly. Coincidence had statistical boundaries, and this had crossed them. When the inner hatch opened and he floated into the station's equipment module, Commander Marcus was already there, his expression carrying that particular combination of concern and calculation that comes from years of making decisions where wrong answers kill people. The sphere stayed in position for another 40 seconds after the cameras went dark, Marcus said, without preamble, because there was no point in small talk when you'd both seen something that rewrote assumptions. I kept visual through cupola. Then it moved. Didn't drift, didn't tumble, just accelerated perpendicular to our orbital plane and disappeared. No gradual fade, no thrust signature that I could see. It was there, and then it wasn't. Carson began the careful process of removing his EMU suit, the ritual of unfastening connections and checking seals, hands moving through muscle memory while his mind processed Marcus's words. An object accelerating perpendicular to orbital plane meant fighting both the station's velocity and Earth's gravitational pull, meant delta-V calculations that would require propellant mass or energy expenditure that should have been visible, should have registered on something. The station's internal communication system chirped, and Dr. Quinn Morrison's voice filled the module. But this time, there was someone else on the channel too. A voice Carson didn't recognize, deeper, with the flat affect of someone who spent their career in windowless rooms making decisions based on classified parameters. Commander Hayes, Specialist Webb, this is a priority channel. We need you both to proceed to the Unity module for immediate secure conference. Commander Hayes, please ensure the channel is private. Marcus met Carson's eyes for half a second, a look that communicated what words couldn't in a recorded environment, then keyed the response. Understood, Houston. We're moving to Unity now. They floated through the station's narrow corridors, past the humming life support systems and the smell that every spacecraft eventually acquires, that mixture of recycled air and human occupation and electronics running at the edge of their thermal limits. In Unity, Marcus activated the station's encrypted communication system, the one used for classified Department of Defense payloads and National Reconnaissance Office coordination, the system that Carson had only seen used 3 times in 562 days of cumulative orbital time. The screen flickered to life, showing not the usual mission control layout, but a different room, darker, with fewer people. Dr. Quinn was there, but off to the side, and the central camera position was occupied by the man with the flat voice, 50-ish, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that said Senior Bureaucracy rather than Flight Operations. "Gentlemen, I'm Robert Kellerman, Associate Administrator for the Office of Safety and Mission Assurance. What you observed during today's EVA is now classified under National Security Space Operations Directive, the same protocol we use for nuclear detection satellites and signals intelligence platforms. You will not discuss this event with anyone outside this channel. You will not reference it in personal communications. The official record will show a nominal EVA with early termination due to camera system malfunction." Carson felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear exactly, but recognition of a pattern. The kind of pattern you see in documentaries about things that happened decades ago after the people involved are retired or dead or silenced by NDAs and security clearances. "Sir, with respect, we have telemetry data, multiple visual confirmations, and 23 minutes of documented interaction with an unidentified object demonstrating technological capability beyond our current aerospace inventory. That's not something you can classify away." Kellerman's expression didn't change, which was somehow worse than anger would have been. "Specialist Webb, the telemetry data is being reviewed by appropriate personnel. The visual confirmations are noted. And the cameras experienced a technical failure that is under investigation. These are the facts as they will be recorded." Back in Houston, in a windowless analysis room 3 floors below the main Mission Control Center, Blake Torres was staring at screens that showed something impossible in a different way than the sphere had been impossible. Blake had worked telemetry and tracking for NASA for 19 years, had analyzed data from shuttle missions and ISS operations and unmanned probe trajectories, had seen equipment failures and sensor glitches and data corruption from radiation hits and cosmic ray strikes. This wasn't any of those things. The tracking data from the ISS proximity radar showed clear returns during the entire 23-minute window. A spherical object 2 meters in diameter, maintaining precise formation with the station, moving with it, matching its orbital corrections, displaying radar cross-section consistent with a metallic surface. The data was there, time-stamped, verified by redundant systems. But when Blake pulled up the camera footage to correlate visual with radar, something was wrong. The video files showed Carson performing the EVA, showed him working on the radiator array, showed the normal background of Earth and stars and black space, but no sphere. Blake checked the timestamps. The files claimed to cover the period from 1400 hours to 1500 hours UTC on November 8, 2023. But the metadata, the hidden information embedded in every digital file that records when it was created and when it was modified, showed something disturbing. The video files had been modified during the EVA, not after. Someone with access to the ISS data systems had replaced the camera feeds in real time, substituting clean footage for whatever the cameras had actually recorded. The replacement had happened at 14:31 UTC, exactly 4 minutes after Carson first reported visual contact with the sphere. Blake's phone rang, an internal line from the flight director's office, and when he answered, it was Dr. Quinn Morrison's voice, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "Blake, I need you to package all the telemetry data from today's EVA and transfer it to a secure server. You'll receive access credentials within the hour. After the transfer, you'll be asked to sign documentation regarding information security protocols. This is standard procedure for certain categories of orbital events." Blake looked at the screens, at the data that proved something had been there, at the video files that had been altered while the event was still happening, at the timestamps that showed someone had been watching and editing and controlling the narrative in real time, and he understood that standard procedure was a phrase that covered a lot of territory, most of it classified. Understood, sir. I'll have the package ready. On the International Space Station, 380 kilometers above a planet where 8 billion people lived their lives, mostly unaware of what happened in the black above them, Carson Webb floated in his crew quarters, a space the size of a phone booth, and thought about the sphere that had mirrored his movements with impossible precision, about the cameras that had failed with impossible timing, about the official story that was being written in real time to replace what had actually happened. He thought about Taylor Reeves, the reserve astronaut who had been on duty in ground control during the EVA, who had monitored the live feeds before they went dark, and wondered if Taylor was being asked to sign the same kind of documentation that Blake was being offered, the kind that turned witnesses into classified assets, the kind that made questions illegal and answers impossible. 6 weeks after Carson Webb's EVA, in a coffee shop in Alexandria, Virginia, 1,000 miles from the controlled environments of mission control and orbital mechanics, investigative journalist Ethan Cross was reviewing documents that had arrived in his encrypted email from a source who identified themselves only as concerned observer, and whose digital fingerprints suggested access to NASA's internal archival systems. Ethan had spent 12 years covering aerospace and defense, had broken stories about cost overruns on the James Webb Telescope and safety violations in commercial crew programs, had cultivated sources inside every major space agency and contractor, and he recognized the signature of authenticity in what he was reading. These weren't fabrications or conspiracy theory compilations. These were operational reports, incident summaries, telemetry analyses, the bureaucratic paper trail that large organizations generate when something happens that doesn't fit the standard categories. The first document was dated May 19, 1984, a mission anomaly report from Space Shuttle Discovery's STS-41D mission. During a scheduled satellite deployment, EVA, astronaut Michael Hayes, no relation to Commander Marcus Hayes currently aboard the ISS, had reported visual contact with a spherical object approximately 2 meters in diameter that maintained formation with the shuttle for 17 minutes before camera systems experienced what the report called unexplained simultaneous failure across multiple independent feeds. The report noted that Hayes exhibited no signs of psychological distress or spatial disorientation, that his vital signs remained normal throughout the observation period, and that post-flight debriefing was conducted under classified protocols. The final recommendation, stamped in red ink, read, "File under National Security Space Operations, restrict distribution, implement information security protocols for crew." The second document was from June 7, 1996, a joint NASA-Roscosmos technical review of an incident aboard the Mir space station. Cosmonaut Yuri Volkov had observed what he described in the translated transcript as metal sphere, perfect shape, no visible propulsion, following my EVA movements like mirror reflection during maintenance work on Mir's Cavant module. The sphere had been present for 19 minutes. Station cameras captured the first 8 minutes before experiencing what the report termed coordinated system degradation. The document noted that similar incidents had been recorded on 2 previous occasions, in 1984 and 1991, and recommended establishment of a formal protocol between NASA and Roscosmos for handling what it carefully described as non-standard orbital observations requiring security classification. Ethan kept reading. 2007, ISS Expedition 14, American astronaut Jennifer Oakes. 2015, European Space Agency astronaut Klaus Zimmermann aboard the ISS during Expedition 43. 2019, Russian cosmonaut Dmitry Sokolov. The pattern was identical across all incidents. Metallic sphere, 2-meter diameter, perfect movement mirroring, duration between 15 and 25 minutes, camera failures at critical moments, security classifications, non-disclosure agreements, and something else that Ethan noticed as he cross-referenced the dates with public NASA records. In every case, the astronaut or cosmonaut who made the observation was rotated back to Earth earlier than scheduled, their return attributed to medical evaluations or family emergencies or operational requirements, reasons that sounded plausible individually but formed a pattern when viewed collectively. Ethan spent 3 days verifying what he could through public sources, checking mission dates against NASA archives, confirming crew rotations, looking for the edges where the official story didn't quite align with documented timelines. Then he reached out to Dr. Amelia Morgan, 76 years old, a former NASA astrophysicist who had worked at Johnson Space Center from 1989 to 2003 before retiring to teach at University of Colorado Boulder. Her specialty had been orbital mechanics and telemetry analysis. According to the documents Ethan had received, she had been part of the team that analyzed the Mir incident in 1996. When Ethan called and explained what he was investigating, there was a long silence on the phone. The kind of silence that meant someone was making a calculation about risk and truth, and how much longer they had to care about the consequences of either. "If we do this conversation, it's not for attribution," Dr. Morgan said finally, her voice carrying the weight of nearly 8 decades and the particular exhaustion that comes from keeping secrets that matter. "You can say a former NASA analyst or a source familiar with the programs, but not my name. Not until I'm past the point where it matters." They met in her office at the university, a small room overlooking the Flatirons, walls covered with orbital diagrams and mission patches from an era when shuttle flights were routine and the ISS was still being assembled piece by piece. She made tea, Earl Grey, and sat across from Ethan with the careful posture of someone whose spine had learned to compensate for decades of sitting at consoles and staring at screens. "The Mir incident in '96 wasn't the first time I saw this pattern," she began, her hands wrapped around the mug for warmth despite the office heater running. "I was junior staff on the analysis team for the '84 Discovery event. 28 years old, fresh PhD. Thought I was going to help humanity reach for the stars. Instead, I learned that sometimes the stars reach back, and when they do, the official policy is to look away and classify the evidence." She described the telemetry from Mir, data that showed an object matching station velocity with precision that exceeded any known aerospace capability, moving in perfect synchronization with the cosmonauts' EVA maneuvers, demonstrating what she called predictive positioning that suggested active tracking and response capability beyond our technological baseline. After Mir, NASA and Roscosmos established a joint protocol, Dr. Morgan continued, her eyes fixed on something beyond the window, beyond the mountains, maybe beyond the thin blue line of atmosphere that separated their conversation from the black where these encounters happened. It was never written down in any official document that you'll find in archives. It was communicated verbally, through chains of command, the kind of institutional knowledge that gets passed from one administrator to another. The protocol had 3 parts. Don't acknowledge the observation publicly, don't engage with the object if encountered, and document everything but classify it immediately under the highest available security designation. The logic was that we didn't know what these objects were, didn't know their origin or purpose, and until we had better understanding, the safest approach was silence and observation. Ethan asked the question that mattered most. In your professional opinion, based on the telemetry data you analyzed, what were these objects? Dr. Morgan took a long sip of tea, and when she answered, her voice had the quality of someone stating a conclusion that had taken decades to accept. The objects demonstrated technological capability that doesn't exist in any human aerospace program, classified or otherwise. They appeared to be observing human activity in orbit. They responded to human movement with precision that implied sophisticated tracking. And they've been doing it, based on the documented incidents I'm aware of, for at least 40 years. We're being watched. Whatever is doing the watching has been patient, consistent, and careful not to interfere directly. But they want us to know they're there. That's what the mirroring behavior suggests. Not hostility, not communication exactly, just presence, acknowledgement that they see us, and perhaps that they've always seen us. The conversation with Dr. Amelia Morgan gave Ethan Cross a framework for understanding what Carson Webb had experienced, a pattern that stretched back 4 decades and suggested something that official space agencies had decided was better kept quiet than investigated publicly. But patterns in documents are one thing, and the lives of the people who became part of those patterns are another. Ethan began tracking what happened to the individuals involved in the November 8, 2023 incident. The human consequences of encountering something that wasn't supposed to exist and having that encounter classified into silence. Carson Webb was rotated back to Earth on December 16, 2023, 38 days earlier than his scheduled return date. The official NASA press release cited medical evaluation protocols and routine crew rotation optimization, language that sounded bureaucratic and reasonable until you looked at Carson's pre-flight medical records, which showed a 41-year-old in exceptional health with cardiovascular performance in the 97th percentile for his age group, and no history of psychological issues or spatial adaptation problems. He had logged 562 days in orbit across 3 missions without incident. The medical evaluation that brought him home early was never detailed publicly, and Carson himself made no statements beyond a brief appearance at Johnson Space Center, where he thanked the flight teams and spoke in generalities about the privilege of serving in the astronaut corps. What Ethan learned through sources inside NASA was that Carson spent 11 weeks after his return in what was officially described as extended psychological debriefing and readaptation therapy at the Johnson Space Center's medical facilities. The sessions were conducted by specialists who normally worked with astronauts who had experienced significant trauma, equipment failures that nearly killed them, close calls with debris strikes, the kind of events that could break someone's ability to function in an environment where hesitation meant death. But Carson hadn't experienced equipment failure or near death. He had observed something, reported it through proper channels, followed protocol exactly, and returned safely. The psychological evaluation seemed designed not to help him process trauma, but to assess something else entirely, perhaps to determine how likely he was to talk about what he'd seen, how stable his silence would remain under the pressure of questions he couldn't answer and NDAs he couldn't violate. Riley Chen, the Capcom who had been on duty during Carson's EVA, who had received the initial report of the sphere and relayed the observations to flight controllers, was transferred out of mission control in January 2024. The reassignment was described as a promotion to an operations management position in NASA's Office of Strategic Analysis and Communications, a department that existed mostly on organizational charts and handled the kind of work that didn't require real-time decision-making or direct interaction with active missions. Riley had worked console positions for 7 years, had been Capcom for 2 ISS expeditions and multiple commercial crew flights, had a reputation for calm under pressure and clear communication in crisis situations. The transfer to a desk job away from operations felt less like promotion and more like quarantine, removing someone who knew too much from positions where they might be asked questions or might see patterns in future data. Commander Marcus Hayes remained aboard the ISS, completing his scheduled mission and returning to Earth in March 2024 after 6 months in orbit. He gave the standard post-flight interviews, talked about the beauty of Earth from space, and the international cooperation that made the station possible, and the experiments in materials science and biology that continued to expand human knowledge. But in a small media appearance at a university symposium in May, when a student asked about unusual observations or unexpected phenomena encountered during long-duration spaceflight, Marcus paused for several seconds before answering. "Some things we observe in orbit require further study and discretion," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "Space is an environment that constantly challenges our understanding and occasionally presents phenomena that don't fit neat categories. The responsible approach is thorough documentation and analysis, not speculation." The answer said everything by saying nothing. The kind of response that acknowledged something existed without defining what that something was. Taylor Reeves, the reserve astronaut who had been monitoring live feeds from ground control during Carson's EVA, who had watched the camera footage before it went dark and presumably had seen whatever the cameras captured before the feeds were replaced, resigned from NASA 4 months after the incident. The resignation was quiet, no press release, just an internal notification that appeared in the astronaut office's personnel updates. Taylor took a position with Blue Origin, one of the commercial space companies competing for contracts and developing orbital capabilities outside the traditional government programs. In a brief email exchange with Ethan, Taylor declined to be interviewed, but offered a single sentence. "Some experiences make you reevaluate whether the career you've built is worth the constraints that come with it." When Ethan pressed for clarification, Taylor stopped responding. Blake Torres, the telemetry specialist who had seen the tracking data that proved something was there, and the metadata that showed someone had altered the camera footage in real time, still worked at Johnson Space Center, still analyzed orbital mechanics and trajectory data, still sat at consoles where numbers told stories that official narratives sometimes contradicted. But in October 2024, Blake appeared on an independent aerospace podcast, speaking carefully and never mentioning specific incidents or classified information, discussing in general terms the challenges of reconciling observational data with institutional requirements. "Data doesn't lie," Blake said during the interview, his voice carrying the fatigue of someone who had spent too many hours looking at screens that showed one truth, while official reports documented another. "Our tracking systems are sophisticated, redundant, designed to detect objects down to 10 centimeters in size, traveling at orbital velocities. When those systems register something, when multiple independent sensors confirm the same object, that's not malfunction or misinterpretation. That's detection. And if detected objects are later classified or explained away or disappeared from official records, that's not a failure of technology. That's a decision about what information the public gets to have access to. Our data shows we're not just monitoring space. Something in space is monitoring us." The International Space Station, 380 kilometers above a planet where most people never think about what happens in the black above them, received an upgrade in October 2024. NASA announced the installation of 14 new external cameras, high-resolution systems with 8K imaging capability, infrared detection, and autonomous object tracking powered by machine learning algorithms. The official justification was enhanced debris monitoring, improved documentation of robotic operations, and better situational awareness for the growing amount of commercial and international traffic in low Earth orbit. The budget for the camera system was $47 million. For debris monitoring, the cameras were positioned to provide complete coverage of the station's exterior, overlapping fields of view that eliminated blind spots and ensured that any approaching object would be captured from multiple angles. But when Ethan obtained the technical specifications through a Freedom of Information Act request and analyzed the camera positioning diagrams, he noticed something that made him pause and reread the documents 3 times to confirm what he was seeing. Each camera had a defined field of view, a cone of space that its sensors could observe. The installation plan showed careful placement to maximize coverage and minimize gaps. But there was one sector, a specific region in the station's south orbital vector, exactly the bearing where Carson's encounter had occurred, where all 14 cameras had identical angular limitations in their coverage. Not a blind spot created by structural obstruction or technical limitation. A designed gap. A shared exclusion zone that appeared in every camera's field of view at the same coordinates, as if the cameras had been deliberately positioned to avoid looking at one specific area of space. It could have been coincidence, an accident of geometry and engineering constraints. Or it could have been something else, a tacit acknowledgement that some observations were better avoided, that some areas of space were meant to remain unexamined by official systems, that after 40 years of encounters and classifications and silences, the institutional response had evolved from surprise to protocol to something that looked almost like accommodation, like a decision not to document what couldn't be explained and couldn't be controlled. We spent centuries looking upward, building telescopes and radio arrays and space stations, searching for signs of intelligent life in a cosmos that seemed empty and silent and indifferent to our existence. We asked questions into the void and listened for answers that never came. And we built our understanding of the universe around the assumption that we were alone, or at least unobserved, that our small blue planet was invisible to whatever else might exist in the infinite dark. But what if the real question was never whether they exist, never whether intelligence evolved elsewhere among the hundreds of billions of stars in our galaxy and the trillions of galaxies beyond our reach? What if the question we should have been asking was simpler and more terrifying? How long have they been watching? How many decades? How many centuries? How many millennia have we been observed by something with the patience to mirror our movements and the technology to appear and vanish at will and the discretion to never make contact, never interfere, never reveal themselves in ways we couldn't classify away or explain into silence? And if they've been watching this long, if they've seen our civilization develop from primitive radio to nuclear weapons to stations in orbit, if they've observed our progress and our failures and our slow expansion into the realm beyond our atmosphere, what are they waiting for? What threshold do we need to cross? What capability do we need to demonstrate? What maturity do we need to achieve before the watching stops and something else begins? Are we being evaluated, measured against some standard we don't understand? Or are we simply interesting enough to observe, but not yet significant enough to acknowledge, like researchers watching animals in a habitat, documenting behavior but never intervening, waiting for the moment when intervention becomes necessary or meaningful or inevitable? The sphere that followed Carson Webb for 23 minutes knew he was there, responded to his movements, demonstrated awareness and capability that exceeded our technology by margins we can't measure. It wasn't hiding. It was showing itself while staying just outside our ability to prove definitively what it was. And somewhere in offices with security clearances and classifications and institutional memories that span generations, people have decided that the appropriate response to being observed is to observe back in silence, to document without acknowledging, to know without admitting what we know. The cosmos is vast beyond human comprehension, and we occupy an infinitesimal fraction of it, a pale blue dot in an ocean of black that extends in all directions for distances that make our largest numbers feel inadequate. We used to think that vastness meant we were special, that the universe was made for us, that we were the purpose and the center. Then we learned we were small, insignificant, alone in the cosmic scale. But perhaps we were never alone. Perhaps we've always been seen. And that changes everything about what it means to look up at the stars and wonder who else is looking back.